David, I guess, the one thing we know about markets is that they are constantly be throwing curveballs and challenges at you. And as a professional money manager, I guess the most important thing to you is have a sound philosophy to be able to process and manage all these different events that markets throw at you. Can you maybe give us an overview of how you think about your investment philosophy and process within the investment management framework?
Our investment process is very much geared to finding exceptional managers that have an edge, and combining them in portfolios on behalf of our clients. Now, managers come in all different shapes and sizes, so we need a process which is flexible enough to be able to accommodate them, but also rigorous enough to enable to be consistent and deliver outcomes that will benefit our clients. So there's always this tension trying to accommodate a really great manager, as well as the rules around our process and our framework to ensure that we can deliver consistency to our clients. So our investment process needs to be able to evolve, to be able to think about what could go wrong, to make sure that when we are backing a manager, we're never completely exposing ourselves to a particular view. But at the same time, it mustn't be so rule-bound that we aren't able to get managers that can make a difference or do something that can really benefit the portfolio. Now, what we tend to find, broadly speaking, is there are sort of two different kinds of managers that we look for. The one manager focuses on a particular asset class and does that really, really well. The other manager will bring a bit more broader capabilities across asset classes that we can utilize. And we find it's very important in our process that we're able to combine both kinds of managers into our framework. If we just focus on managers that have asset allocation capability, we find we are ignoring a large percentage of the universe. At the same time, if we just focus on specialist managers, we could potentially ignore the tactical skills that other managers could also bring. So these are the tensions that we're always managing in our philosophy and our process. And I suppose at the end of the day, what we tell ourselves is that, we don't want to be absolutely right, but we don't want to be completely wrong. And we're always thinking about what could go wrong and what we might need in the portfolio to enable it to deliver more consistent returns to the client. So it's an evolving process. It's a process that tries to listen to itself. It's a process that tries to learn from the decisions that we make.
David, you've mentioned two words in particular: consistency and repeatability. And certainly, I guess that is the big challenge that investment managers are faced with year after year. How do you think about that, and how do you incorporate, or what do you incorporate in your investment philosophy and process to ensure that you are, constantly aiming for that consistency and repeatability?
That's a very good question, and that talks to a lot of what we try to achieve in our process. So one way we think about that is if an investment team member recommends a particular manager, for example, if another member of the team were to be given a similar kind of responsibility, they'd get to a similar kind of recommendation. It's very easy to get swayed by your own personal biases or by recent performance, for example, or even by the reputation of a manager. So we try to think of ways that we engage as a team that can try to break these things down. So one way we've been quite deliberate about is to keep a relatively small team so that we can typically challenge each other robustly, but still have accountability for individual decision making. Another way we sometimes use is we do what we call a blind test, where we don't know who the managers are, and we look at a performance profile, for example, of a manager, and compared to other managers, and we've got to try to select which performance profile we think makes the most sense without knowing who the manager is. You can also deal with other kinds of biases. For example, your endpoint bias, you might weight more recent performance more heavily. We try to eliminate those kind of biases too.
Now, David, you've mentioned biases a few times, and certainly what we've seen is in the last few decades, or last few years in particular, several major global asset management firms have spoken about how they incorporate behavioral finance within their decision-making process. And certainly from what you've said to me, it sounds like that is also true in your team and the way you go about that awareness of biases and behavioral finance and those type of errors, and how do you eliminate them from your process? Do you want to maybe touch on how you think about that?
Yeah, one of the interesting things we've been grappling with as a team is the resilience of managers' own approaches and of our approach as well. So, there's been a lot of discussion about, for example, the return of the value cycle, and managers that have stuck to the value cycle through significant periods of underperformance, for example. We are increasingly, particularly in a South African context where our market is relatively small, are looking for manager strategies that are a little bit more flexible or able to adapt. So rather than say we must only find managers that perform certain roles, we do try to look at a manager strategy where they are able to change their minds to some extent or adapt to current conditions. And in a way, a multi-manager strategy, this is the big benefit of a multi-manager strategy itself. We're able to evolve and adapt our strategy depending on what makes sense from the perspective of what we need to achieve for our clients. So we've been able to bring in passive into certain of our strategies. For example, over time, we don't need to make a big philosophical argument about active versus passive. We can say, no, there's a role for passive in this part of the portfolio, or there's a role for a top-down South African equity manager, or the kind of offshore managers we need to bring in need to have more of a creative destruction or growth bias. And this is quite a strong advantage to a multi-manager process over many single manager strategies which need to stick to a particular kind of way of doing things too. So we like to think our investment philosophy kind of gives us the best of both worlds.
David, you've spoken about consistency as being very important for the team. Maybe if you could touch on how you incorporate that within your manager selection as well as your asset allocation process.
Yeah, so we achieve consistency in a number of different ways. The first point is we only look at managers that are better than average. Now that sounds trite in a sense, but we have quite effective ways of eliminating managers that don't make the grade. They might do well in the short term, but we can see that those returns aren't going to sustain themselves. Or they have a style, or they have business risk associated with their organization, which makes us realize that these guys just aren't able to focus on their portfolios. There's too much team turnover going on, or the business is under too much pressure. And so even though we don't actually know what the future is going to hold, we can quite easily, relatively easily, eliminate a large proportion of managers that we don't necessarily want to engage with. So that's an important starting point for us. The second point is once we've identified these managers that we think are good, we need to give them enough time for them to be able to express themselves. And that's the second big challenge that many of us have with getting consistency into our portfolios. We don't give managers enough time. We react too much to the short term and too much, say, to potential under or outperformance of these managers. So you'll find at PPS Investments, we've partnered with many managers for more than a decade. And that helps us build strong relationships with the managers and stick with the managers through good times and bad times, because we know through the cycle they're going to do really well. So that's the second important point about how we achieve consistency. And the third most important point is we are deliberately looking for managers that we think are different from each other and can make a difference. And this introduces consistency into our process, because managers who have quite strong different views, their views can get slightly more mitigated if we combine them in a portfolio. So we don't end up with a very extreme profile of performance because we're combining managers which help lessen that. We also take responsibility ourselves in many mandates for part of the asset allocation decision. And that can also improve consistency into our solutions, because it gives us exposure to a completely different specialized set of managers, as well as our very structured asset allocation framework. So the way we build portfolios also introduces consistency. And maybe the final point is, which I alluded to earlier, is we interrogate our decisions and we think about how we made decisions, and we're always trying to do better. And that introduces consistency, because one is always holding oneself to a high level of account and making an investment decision to argue, is this consistent with our process? Is this consistent with what we are trying to achieve? Is this consistent with what we did last week, last month, last year? And maybe the last point on consistency I'll just like to talk to is we don't try to make lots of investment decisions. There's 2 or 3 material decisions that we need to try to get right every year. And if we can get those 2 or 3 right, if we can identify what those are, that will lead to significant benefit to our clients and consistency over time.
Thank you, David. Thanks for sharing those insights. Thanks for lifting the bonnet a little bit and giving us a perspective on your investment philosophy as well as your process. Certainly, one of the things I take away from it is consistency is a critical piece of the equation, and I think you have very strong alignment between your team and your stakeholders and clients as far as consistency is concerned. Thank you for your time.